We have some huge NHL trade and free agent rumors fresh off the 32 Thoughts podcast. We're talking about teams like the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Maple Leafs, the Seattle Kraken, the Boston Bruins, and the Chicago Blackhawks. We have some prospect signings, some playoff updates, including some injuries. All that and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover here today. There's a lot of information from Elliotte Friedman on the latest 32 Thoughts podcast that was very interesting on some potential offseason movement, which we'll get into here in just a couple of moments. First up, last night in the playoffs, we saw round one come to a close with two Game 7s, both going to overtime, both awesome hockey games. As hockey fans, I don't think we could have asked for much better of a first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs with all the Game 7s and the overtime to boot. It was really solid hockey, really entertaining, and we saw the Calgary Flames finally get past Jake Oettinger and the Dallas Stars. Jake Oettinger had a performance that was really a standout performance. Like, he is 100% the number one goalie moving forward, another top young goalie in the league with a bit of a coming out party there in Dallas. Awesome performance. He has a lot to look forward to here in his career. Johnny Gaudreau comes through with the overtime victory, overtime game-winning goal, series-clinching goal, which is huge for him. I mean, Johnny Gaudreau, as much as he's been a great regular season performer, he has had a knack for not coming through in the playoffs. And for the most part, in this series, I thought Gaudreau and Tkachuk and Tyler Toffoli, for that matter, were all a little bit too quiet and needed to come through here, and they did that. But at least they might not have had the strongest offensive series as a whole, but it came through when it mattered most, and that's certainly going to impact Gaudreau as an upcoming pending free agent with like I said, with a reputation for not getting it done. You know what? Even though we'll see, because the playoffs aren't over, just what he'll be capable of here. But that's a massive goal, and that's coming up clutch in the big moments. That's where you become, obviously a big part of the team in history here. So we'll see what happens with Calgary in the next round against Edmonton. But a huge win to get that team in the first round, or out of the first round for the first time in a long time. So that's really big for the Calgary Flames. We saw the New York Rangers eliminate the Pittsburgh Penguins, also in overtime, 4-3 win. Artemi Panarin, who in my opinion didn't also have a great series, just like Gaudreau. Like, they didn't have great series, but they came up big when it mattered most. Panarin gets the OT winner, obviously on the power play. Now, there was a bit of a controversial play there that led to that Rangers power play. Penguin player before that had his helmet taken off, but it was basically ripped off by, I think it was Lafreniere, if I'm not mistaken. He had to exit, and of course, as he exits, the Rangers were able to score because he's out of the play. So it's certainly not that wasn't good. I mean, the rule is the rule. The referee's hands are kind of tied, but it kind of sucks, and it really should have been. There should be something changed, I think, with the rule. I don't know if they really need to absolutely exit the ice immediately, or if there should be a penalty for trying to take off an opponent's helmet to put him in that predicament or whatnot. But it was certainly a controversial play for sure. But at the end of the day, the Rangers and the Flames both move on in overtime with thrilling victories for their home fans. So for the most part, the teams that scored first and the home teams were the bulk of the winners here over the weekend as round number one comes to a close. There's no games tonight. Round two gets underway tomorrow. So Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll see all the game ones take place here and get started. As teams are being eliminated, we're certainly learning more and more about injuries as well, which we'll have to wait for more on for some teams. I know with the Bruins, I know Grzelcyk, I believe, was dealing with a bad shoulder, is going to require surgery. I know in Washington, there's a reveal that Backstrom is dealing with a hip issue, which is going to be potentially pretty serious. And from a non-playoff team, Mark Stone in Vegas appears to be having back surgery in a couple of days. It's not 100% finalized yet because there is still a couple more doctors he's going to be speaking to get some final opinions. But Kelly McCrimmon today during his press conference, during talking about the coaching change, made that known. He said it's not 100%, but it's looking very probable that Stone has back surgery later this week. But he's hoping that he'd be ready to go for training camp in the fall. Of course, the big news earlier today, we saw Peter DeBoer in Vegas be let go. Already word from Elliotte Friedman that there's a lot of chatter around Barry Trotz, and maybe Barry Trotz becoming available. was an influence on this decision. You know, like that's what they did before when they had Gerard Gallant. Gallant was doing a good job. Gerard Gallant actually had a verbal agreement in place for an extension. But then Peter DeBoer became available, and they decided that he was an upgrade, and Gallant goes, and DeBoer comes in. And now DeBoer goes, and Trotz might be coming in. Trotz is going to have lots of other options, so I'm not sure how eager he is to get something settled real quick. We'll find out here probably in the next little while if he's going to be talking to teams or if he's going to be taking his time, if he's what have you. But I know Philly, Winnipeg, etc., likely all very interested there as well. We had some prospect signings to talk about here today. Detroit have signed a 1-year ELC with Pontus Andreasson, who's a 23-year-old Swedish prospect who put up a pretty solid year in the SHL this year. 38 points in 52 games, so another interesting Swedish player there for Detroit. We saw a couple of goalies get their ELCs that were former first-round picks. The Minnesota Wild have signed Jesper Wallstedt, who was a 2021 first-rounder, gets his 3-year ELC. The Swedish goaltender should make the jump to North America. He put up a real solid year over in Europe this year, 1.98 goals against and a .918 save percentage, and he's the real deal from what it looks like. He should be a real solid goalie. Be interesting to see what Minnesota does with their goaltending situation this offseason, but they do have him to look forward to. Is likely, hopefully taking over as a starter will be their projection here in a couple of years' time. And Yaroslav Askarov in Nashville gets his 3-year entry-level contract as well. So, of course, Askarov was also a very high first-round pick, 11th overall in 2020. He was drafted with a lot of real high praise, a lot of high potential. Had a couple of rough World Junior Championships, but pretty solid in league play over in Russia, so we'll see. But still a really solid piece of the puzzle in Nashville moving forward as well. In Boston, have finally signed 2019 former first-rounder John Beecher to a 3-year entry-level contract as well. He gets his contract after 3 years of college hockey at the University of Michigan. Now, as I mentioned, between the Jeff Merrick Show and the Elliot Friedman and Jeff Merrick 32 Thoughts podcast today, of course, those two talk a lot together between the podcast and radio. Lots of information here, especially on teams that have been recently eliminated from the playoffs. All kinds of juicy information here, so let's dive right in and get started. Of course, one of the teams they talked about was Boston and the future of Patrice Bergeron. Now, we've talked a bit about this. We haven't really learned a whole lot more about what his plans are, but there's a lot of speculations we've talked about before that he very well might retire. He reiterated to media today himself that he needs time to make a decision, and it's not quite clear what his plans are. He wants to talk to his family. That's the biggest thing, but there's been some talk for some time that when his contract was expiring, that there was a good chance he might be done. I mean, we'll have to see. But Jeff Merrick was talking about on the podcast, if Bergeron does retire, could Jonathan Toews to Boston make a lot of sense? Because clearly they're already a little bit weak down the middle. You lose Bergeron, that makes you very weak down the middle. They still have some good pieces in Boston. It's not like they'd be expected to go from wild card playoff team to the lottery or anything of that nature. They still have Brad Marchand. They still have David Pastrnak. They still have Charlie McAvoy. Two good goalies in Allmark and Swayman. Brandon Carlo's there. Taylor Hall. They have some good players. So they're not going to just fall off the map. That's not what we're expecting. But the area of weakness on that team is the depth at center after losing David Krejci. And now they lose Bergeron. If that happens as well, that's going to be a big hole. So Jonathan Toews, obviously, is a centerman. He plays a similar style to game to Bergeron, a solid two-way play. Bergeron, as of lately, at least, the last couple of years, for sure, a little bit more strong offensively than Toews has been. Overall, throughout their careers, you could argue that Toews and Bergeron have a lot of similarities. I just think Bergeron has probably played better later into his career than Toews has. But at the same time, they're both very, very well accomplished. Toews has 1 year left in Chicago. Jeff Merrick made a good point that Toews and Kane, as much as they've said all the right things about being in the Hawks organization, being part of this rebuild, Jonathan Toews really didn't show a lot of interest in being, around to go through this rebuild with a lot of youth on that team. And he said it kind of gets him out of that and sends him off to a competitive spot where he can still play a big role and be looked to. So no rumor suggesting that they're actually having those conversations. The Bruins are going to obviously wait and see if Bergeron wants to play. It's believed that if he wants to play, that the Bruins will sign him. To what term, though, we don't know. A lot of question marks there. So could you see Jonathan Toews to Boston as a Bergeron replacement if Bergeron decides to retire or shocks us all and decides to move on and play somewhere else. He himself said he doesn't see himself playing anywhere else, but there was a lot of rumors about Bergeron to Montreal, which are debatable. I mean, I see the connections, connecting the dots, but it certainly seems like a bit of a stretch, but we'll see. I mean, it's certainly fun to think about and talk about. Probably less likely to happen. Now, another big team that they really dissected today was the Pittsburgh Penguins. We know that they have some major question marks facing this team. One big one was already answered earlier this year, was the change in ownership. So we know that with Fenway Group taking over ownership of this team, that are the question marks around them. Are they going to want to make changes at the top end of things? Is there any more people they're going to want to either replace or changes that people they want to bring in, etc.? We know that the Fenway Group, based on how they've operated their other teams, are very, very analytical and really rely on analytics a lot to make a lot of high-end choices here and decisions. So some of these players that we're talking about, analytics might not be the most favorable for them. They're a piece of the puzzle here, but they're not everything. It depends on who you talk to, I guess. But some of the big names that we're looking at here, like Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, Brian Rust, not to mention Evan Rodriguez, are all unrestricted free agents. Could they all return? It's very unlikely. From a cap perspective, very unlikely. Now, of course, you'd have to have some veterans like Letang and Malkin take big discounts to make it work. And right now, that seems unlikely to happen. There's reports from Rob Rossi, actually, of course, as well, who was a Penguin writer and insider. And Penguins... American Friedman did touch on this as well, but didn't go into the specific numbers like Rossi did, that Malkin and Letang were essentially offered 3-year contracts to match Crosby's remaining term on his deal to stay, and it was estimated to be around $5 million. And both deals for both players were basically considered somewhat nowhere near the mark to get it done. Somewhat insulting, in fact. Now, it's also believed that Crosby wasn't too happy with these offers either, so I'm not sure what that is really going to have an impact on. Clearly he's got a lot of influence over things in Pittsburgh, but at the same time we'll see where things go here. But Malkin, it seemed to be okay with a 3-year term to match Crosby, but the money was nowhere near what he was willing to accept. Also heard Ray Ferraro make a quick comment on this on Overdrive today, saying that he doesn't see Malkin taking a big discount to stay in Pittsburgh either, and he himself said he'd be shocked if Malkin returned because of that. So we'll see, but Pittsburgh could look extremely different next year if all these things that are being discussed here actually seem to come to be. Friedman said that Letang and the Penguins were philosophically not close. So I think by the sounds of that Letang wanted more term and more money. So as much as they like these guys and they'd like to be legacy players in Pittsburgh and finish their careers there, it's not sounding like they're anywhere close to getting it done. Friedman did say on Brian Rust's front that they had some small movements, but nowhere near being close to be able to say that anything was imminent. So Rust is also very much a big question mark. Rodriguez theoretically should be a little bit easier to get done. Doesn't have the long-term, high level of play like these guys do, so he should be a cheaper contract. So, but at the same time, he had a really solid year, so he'll definitely get a raise, but how much, it's hard to say. And it's also believed that Marc-Andre Fleury is very interested in returning to Pittsburgh as well. We know Casey DeSmith, his contract's expiring. Tristan Jarry's only got 1 more year left on his deal. He's not making a ton of money, around $3.5 million, and believes that part of the reason why Fleury refused to go to Washington was that he really wanted to go back to Pittsburgh as a free agent if he could, and if he went to Washington, he was concerned he might not be able to make it back to Pittsburgh. At least that's Friedman's theory on that situation. So it is possible we could see a Fleury reunion in Pittsburgh, but at the same time, even though he's good friends with Crosby, if Malkin and Letang and all those guys don't return, will Fleury want to go back? I just don't know. I mean, hard to say how everybody feels about everything, but it really sounds like there's nowhere near anywhere close getting deals done to keep these guys in Penguin uniforms. So you really have to think that there's a real solid possibility here that Letang and Malkin might not both be back. At one point, a lot of people thought that Letang was more likely to go because it was reported that he wanted more term and more money, whereas Malkin was being reported as being a little bit more flexible with shorter term and less money. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. So big questions in Pittsburgh. You have to wonder what's going to happen. Let me know what your thoughts are. Do Letang and Malkin and others return? Do they go? Does Fleury return? How does it all shake out in Pittsburgh during this really busy offseason by the looks of things in Penguins Nation here. Now, another team that might be interested in Letang is also likely going to be interested in John Klingberg is the Seattle Kraken. That Friedman made mention on the podcast. He expects them to be extremely aggressive and likely help set some of the marketplace in free agency with some of these top-end players that are going to be looking for big term and big money. They're definitely in the market for a big-time offensive D. It was reported before that Klingberg was high on their radar, but if Letang doesn't work out in Pittsburgh and hits the market, he very well could be another that they look to. Not necessarily saying they would go for both, probably not, but one or the other. Very likely to be a big target with the Kraken. And of course, they spent a lot of time talking about the Maple Leafs. They're obviously going to get a lot of airtime because of the fascinating situation that they're presented with after 6 consecutive years of first-round exits. Where do we go from here? I mean, do the Maple Leafs run it back? Do they make small tweaks? Do they make big changes? What do they do? What does Kyle Dubas and Sheldon Keefe return? Now, Friedman and a lot of other people believe Dubas and Keefe likely do return next year. Now, I had mentioned on a previous video a few days ago, I wasn't sure about Dubas' contract because I had heard some reports that he was expiring, but Friedman confirmed today that he's entering the final year. He's got one more year. So do they let him go into that as like a lame duck GM with no extension? Do they discuss an extension and get that done? How does ownership deal with Dubas and Shanahan here? That's going to be a big question that they face as well. At the same time, now, here's kind of what Friedman's thoughts were around some of the Leaf players. Now, we talked a bit before about maybe a player like a Jake Muzzin being looked to be shopped, Peter Mrazek, and that could be the case. But like I mentioned before, Muzzin's going to be tough to move because he does have a no trade. Mrazek is going to be tough to move because he didn't play well, but easier because he has no trade protection in a sense. But they come to the conclusion that part of the issue here is that they really need a top 6 forward that's really, really, really tough to play against. So Michael Bunting was a help, but it's not enough. And they have guys that have that grit and that toughness, but they all play bottom 6 roles and don't play a lot of minutes. They tried to play Nick Ritchie at that role this year, and it didn't work out. So I know Merrick made a mention of could Tyler Bertuzzi be a fit there. They were very interested in trying to trade for Bertuzzi about 2 years ago, and it never worked out. So Detroit didn't pull the trigger, but like a guy like that that's really tough to play against, drives teams nuts, and will stick up for his teammates, be physical, like a good power forward type of player that's just, really tough to play against. That's really what they need to add into that mix for the top 6. And could it actually turn out to be, like he used the word like a Kawhi summer, meaning obviously with the Raptors when they made the Kawhi Leonard trade, when they traded DeMar DeRozan, he's like, could Kyle Dubas, and he said he doesn't know for sure that they're going to do this, but he has to think that it's at least being considered, make a big trade, like an NHL trade, like a hockey trade, player for player, maybe not, it might be one for one, it might not be, but a case where you're taking one of your big-time popular players, trading them for another big-time player just to get a different mix. So, for example, like the player that I'm talking about here with, player X or player question mark that we're talking about that's going to be really hard to play against, be a solid top 6 guy with a lot of offensive output, but, be that agitator kind of power forward. Could they trade like a William Nylander for him, for example? There's no rumor saying Nylander's being shopped. I don't want to hear anything about that. That is just a suggestion. So could they take a player like that? Because if you look at it, they're not trading Tavares. He's got a full no move. And I don't see a scenario where Matthews and Marner are dealt. They're by far their 2 best players. So if they're going to trade a big 4, it's going to have to be Nylander. There's just no doubt about it. Not saying they're going to, but if they go down that road, to me, he's likely the guy that they do. Now, the other option here is that agitating player that they want to get in with the killer instinct and the tough to play against. Could it even be a center iceman? Now, John Tavares has been a center along with Austin Matthews, but they discussed the fact that Tavares is not exactly, keeping up wise, analytically especially, at the center ice position, and he feels that they need to move Tavares to the wing. Tavares has never been the quickest guy out there, never been the fleetest of foot. Skating's definitely declined a little bit, having a hard time keeping up. So maybe moving Tavares to the wing and bringing in another center to work with him. So, or do they consider swapping Marner to a center? That's a possibility as well. Like, do they attempt to turn Marner from a real good playmaking, high-performing winger to a center iceman and go Matthews, Marner, your 1-2 centers, and maybe play Tavares on the wing with either one of them? Or do they move Tavares to the wing and they go Matthews, Marner, Tavares, and then you bring in another center to play with William Nylander and whoever that other top 6 forward is going to be, Michael Bunting perhaps, okay? So, but if you're keeping all those pieces, how are you getting that other piece to change things up? Like that, somebody's got to go. And they need the cap space, right? So that's why I think I might come down to Nylander, but time will tell what they do. Lots of questions. We talked about Jack Campbell on the podcast as well. Apparently the Leafs' first offer for a contract for him. This was a while back, mind you, so don't think it's as bad, but he's had a solid year, and I think he was real good in the playoffs, but it was a 3-year deal around $2.75 to $3 million. That's not going to get it done for Jack Campbell, nowhere near. He's going to be at least between $5 and $6 million, so they think that as much as they would like to keep him, it's going to be very much challenging because of that. But we'll see. A lot of this other moves depend. There's some talk that Giordano might even return to the Leafs and do a similar thing like Spezza has done, and Spezza might come back again too. Hard to say because he has been a decent player. Maybe Gio will sign for, because he's a Toronto guy too. Does he want to stick around for another shot? 1-year deal, somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million. Like, will he do that? I don't know if he would, but that's probably what it would take. But apparently there are early discussions about the possibility of that happening. So certainly going to be another fascinating team to watch. Lots of potential changes. Only time will tell what actually happens. So let me know your thoughts on the Leafs, the Penguins, the Bruins, the Hawks. What are we going to see here? It could be a crazy offseason with all kinds of big moves. All kinds of players changing hands here, changing teams. Let me know what you think down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.